Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. Arrival at the place. I don't remember how I ended up here, not clearly anyway. There were fragments of a memory, a long drive through endless rain, the flickering neon signs along a highway that had felt deserted for years, and a voice on the radio whispering something that wasn't part of any song. I'd thought it was static at first, but it was too rhythmic, almost like a chant. The place wasn't marked on any map, though I could have sworn I'd followed the GPS. It stood there like it had always been, at the edge of the woods, its roofline broken and jagged against the thunderous sky. The lodge, the old wooden sign out front declared, its letters barely legible beneath layers of grime and moss. When I stepped inside, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The air was thick with damp and decay, yet there was a strange, metallic tang to it, like rusted iron. The lobby was dimly lit by a single bulb, swinging gently even though there was no breeze. A faded desk sat at the far end, and behind it, an old woman with skin so pale it seemed translucent. She greeted me by name before I could introduce myself. How did she know my name? "You've come far," she said, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Rest is just what you need." The words felt rehearsed, like lines from a play she'd performed for years. Her eyes never met mine, always staring just over my shoulder, as though someone stood behind me. I dared not look. The room key she handed over was unusually heavy, its brass etched with a strange, looping symbol I didn't recognize. "Room 113, she said. "Second floor." The way she emphasized the room number made my stomach turn. Something told me I shouldn't go. I didn't want to go. But my feet moved anyway. The hallway leading to my room was lined with wallpaper that must have once been white. Now it was an ugly, yellowed pattern of spirals, each one warped and incomplete. The floor creaked loudly beneath my steps, yet I felt certain there were softer creaks behind me, lighter, hesitant, as if something small was following but keeping its distance. I turned the key in the lock, and the door swung open easily. The room was sparse: a bed, a chair, a window with curtains so thick they smothered the little light that tried to seep through. I reached to turn on the lamp beside the bed, and when the light flickered on, I froze. There was something written on the wall above the headboard. Words scrawled in what looked like charcoal, though the letters dripped unnaturally, like they were alive. "Leave before you remember." I should have left then. I should have run. But I didn't. Something in me whispered that I had to stay, that leaving now would mean something far worse than staying. So I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the message until my eyes burned, trying to make sense of the growing weight in my chest. That night, I dreamed of a forest I couldn't escape. Part 2. The Whispering Walls. The dream stayed with me when I woke. I couldn't remember much of it, just flashes of black trees, so tall and dense that the sky was nothing but a sliver of gray above. I'd been running through them, chased by something I couldn't see but could feel, heavy and cold, like the weight of a shadow pressing against my spine. When I opened my eyes, the room was wrong. The walls seemed closer, the spirals in the wallpaper pulsing faintly in the dim light. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my throat. The scrawled warning above the bed was gone, the plaster now clean and smooth. For a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard the whispering. It wasn't loud. A faint murmur, almost like a breeze, but sharper. Words I couldn't quite make out, except for the occasional fragment. "Remember, can't leave, not yet." I turned my head toward the sound, and it stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence, the kind that makes your ears strain against the absence of noise. Slowly, I stood and walked to the window. The curtains were heavier than they looked, almost wet to the touch, and when I pulled them aside, I felt my stomach drop. The view outside wasn't what it had been the night before. Instead of the cracked parking lot and the dark line of trees beyond, there was now an empty field shrouded in thick fog. A single figure stood in the distance, barely visible, their shape too still to be natural. The whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and I realized with a shiver that it wasn't coming from outside. It was the walls. The spirals in the wallpaper seemed to ripple, and the murmurs grew more distinct, overlapping like a dozen voices speaking at once. "Don't go to the door." "Not yet." I turned toward the room's door, the heavy key still resting in the lock. My instincts screamed to open it, to run out into the hallway and never stop. But my hand refused to move. The whispering grew louder, and I thought I could feel the vibrations of the words in my chest. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, 3 soft taps, like someone testing the wood. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at the door. The knock came again, slower this time, heavier, as though whatever was on the other side had all the time in the world. The whispers shifted, rising into a chaotic hiss. "Don't let them in." My mouth was dry. I took a step back, my legs trembling, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The door's shadow stretched unnaturally long, spilling across the floor and creeping toward me even though the light source wasn't right. And within that shadow, I thought I saw something move. Something that wasn't me. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. But the shadow remained. It pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I sat on the floor, staring at the door, waiting for the next knock that never came. Part 3, the morning after. When dawn came, I wasn't sure it was real. The light spilling through the window was pale and sickly, like it had been filtered through dirty glass. It barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to pull me out of the haze I'd been trapped in all night. My legs were stiff from sitting on the floor, my back against the wall as I stared at the door. It remained closed, the shadow gone, as if none of it had ever happened. But something had happened. I could still hear the faint echo of those whispers in my ears, as if they'd burned themselves into my memory. I forced myself to stand, muscles protesting, and approached the door cautiously. The key was still in the lock. My hand hovered over it for a moment before I turned it slowly and opened the door. The hallway looked exactly as it had the night before. The faded wallpaper, the uneven wooden floorboards, the faint scent of mildew. But there was no sign of anyone, and the air was still, unnaturally so. I stepped out and glanced down the corridor. The dim light barely reached the end, where the shadows seemed thicker, almost alive. The silence pressed against my ears. I needed to leave. Retracing my steps, I headed toward the lobby. The place felt deserted, the quiet amplifying every creak of the floor beneath my feet. When I reached the front desk, the old woman was gone. In her place was a neatly folded note on the counter. It read, "Breakfast is served in the dining room until 9 a.m. Please join us." I glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:12. My stomach churned, though I wasn't sure if it was hunger or dread. Something about the note felt off. It was too neat, the handwriting too deliberate, like someone had taken painstaking care to make it seem inviting. But there was no one here. No signs of life. I considered ignoring it, walking out the front door and leaving this place behind, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Locked. I jiggled it harder, the metal rattling loudly in the empty space. Nothing. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room for another way out, but all the windows were covered with thick curtains that didn't move, no matter how hard I tugged at them. The dining room was my only option. The double doors creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, a long table was set with mismatched plates and silverware, the surface laden with an assortment of food that looked far too fresh for a place like this. Pancakes stacked high, glistening fruit, eggs steaming in the cold air. It smelled normal. Almost inviting. But the chairs were empty. No sign of the other guests who had supposedly been here before me. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts screaming to turn back. But then I heard it again, the faintest whisper, coming from somewhere deep in the room. "Eat. You'll need your strength." I froze, my hand still on the door. The sound wasn't coming from a specific direction. It felt like it was inside my head, as though the walls themselves were speaking again. My mouth was dry, my heart racing, but I stepped inside. Something was compelling me to stay, something I couldn't explain. I reached for a plate of fruit, my hand trembling, and as I picked up a piece, I noticed the seat at the head of the table. It was the only one that wasn't empty. A man was sitting there. I hadn't seen him when I walked in, he hadn't been there, but now he was. His face was obscured, the morning light casting his features in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me. Heavy. Watching. I put the fruit back and took a step toward the door. His voice stopped me. "You don't remember yet, do you?" he said, his tone calm but cold. Familiar, even though I couldn't place it. My breath caught in my throat. "Remember what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, just enough for me to make out the faintest edge of a smile. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew something I didn't, something I might not want to know. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and left the room, the sound of his low chuckle following me out. Part 4. The Locked Doors. I didn't stop running until I was back in the hallway near my room. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my skin cold and clammy despite the suffocating heat that seemed to radiate from the walls. The memory of that man's voice clung to me like a second shadow. "You don't remember yet." The words replayed in my mind, the weight of them pressing against my skull. What was I supposed to remember? Why did he look familiar? And most importantly, how had he appeared out of nowhere? I reached my room and slammed the door shut behind me, turning the lock with trembling hands. The heavy brass key hung there like an anchor, grounding me in a reality I wasn't sure I trusted anymore. For a long moment, I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath. And then I heard the knocking. It was soft at first, the same hesitant rhythm as the night before. 3 knocks, perfectly spaced, deliberate. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. The whisper started again, faint and relentless, seeping from the walls like smoke. "Don't answer. Don't answer. Don't answer." The knocking grew louder, harder. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't going away. The whispers swirled in my head, overlapping, drowning out my thoughts. My legs felt rooted to the floor, but my hand twitched toward the door handle, as if pulled by an invisible string. "You won't like what you see," the whispers hissed. "But you'll look anyway." I couldn't stop myself. My hand turned the lock and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. At least, that's what it looked like at first. But then I saw it. A shadow. Not cast by me or anything else in the dim corridor. It was too dark, too solid, and it wasn't still. It moved, twitching and shifting, sliding across the floor like spilled ink. It didn't have a shape, not exactly, but I could feel its attention fix on me. It was as though the shadow itself was watching, waiting. And then it stepped forward. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It became something worse. A figure began to take shape, tall and skeletal, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, as if it didn't belong in this world. Its face, God, its face, was a pale, featureless void, smooth as polished stone except for a single crack that split it diagonally, leaking something black and viscous. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It spoke without a mouth, its voice low and grating, like metal dragged against stone. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I stumbled backward into the room, my heel catching on the edge of the carpet. The thing stepped closer, its limbs twisting unnaturally, as if it didn't fully understand how to use them. I tried to slam the door, but it didn't move. My hands pushed against the wood, but it was like shoving against a wall of concrete. The figure stopped just at the threshold. It didn't cross into the room, but its presence filled the space like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. The whispers surged around me, louder than ever, screaming now. "Run! Run!" But I couldn't. My legs refused to move, my body frozen under the weight of its gaze, or lack of one. It tilted its head, the crack in its face widening, spilling more of that inky blackness onto the floor. The smell hit me then, sharp and metallic, like blood and rust. "You'll remember soon," it said, the words echoing in my head even as its voice faded into silence. And then it was gone. Just like that, the weight lifted. The door slammed shut on its own, and I collapsed to the floor, my chest heaving. The room was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, stretching toward me with an almost predatory stillness. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there on the floor, my back pressed against the bed, and tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no matter how hard I tried, one thought kept cutting through my panic, more terrifying than anything else. That figure, it wasn't a stranger. It was familiar, like I'd seen it before. And deep down, I knew that whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. Part 5. The Tragedy Unfolds. The next morning came like an apology, soft light spilling through the curtains, the whispers gone, and the air in the room oddly calm. But the silence was deceptive. I felt it the moment I stepped into a hallway, that same weight, pressing down like the building itself was holding its breath. I needed to find a way out. Last night's encounter was seared into my mind, but even now, the edges of it felt blurred, like a half-forgotten nightmare. The more I tried to piece it together, the less real it seemed. And yet, the crack in the floor just outside my door, dark and wet, was real enough. I followed the hallway toward the lobby again, hoping against reason that someone would be there, someone who could tell me what was happening. But when I reached it, the desk was still empty, and the note was gone. In its place was a different sheet of paper, crumpled and torn, scrawled with jagged handwriting. "They won't let you leave." My pulse quickened. I grabbed the paper, but as I did I heard it, a muffled cry, distant but unmistakable. A child's voice, high-pitched and frantic. My heart sank. I turned toward the sound, my legs moving before I could even think. The cry echoed down the hallway that led deeper into the lodge, past doors that hadn't been there before. I stopped, staring down the corridor. It stretched impossibly long, far longer than the building should have allowed, the faint outline of a child standing at the end. She was small, maybe 6 or 7, her dress old-fashioned, white with lace at the collar. Her back was to me, her head tilted down as though she was staring at her feet. She wasn't crying anymore, but I could feel her distress, a tangible thing that pulled me closer despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" She didn't move. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath me. "Where are your parents?" "Do you?" She turned, and I stopped cold. Her face wasn't right. It wasn't human. Her features were too smooth, her skin a pale, almost translucent gray. And her eyes, God, her eyes, they were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision, warping everything around her. Her mouth opened, far too wide, revealing rows of teeth, jagged and uneven like broken glass. She screamed, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was a roar of anguish and fury, and the walls trembled with it. The tragedy struck before I could even think to run. The floor beneath her gave way with a deafening crack, splitting apart like a wound. She fell, her scream turning into a sharp, choking gasp as the darkness swallowed her whole. The sound echoed, a sickening thud, and then silence. And then, as I stood frozen, the floor beneath me began to crack. I turned and ran, my breath coming in panicked gasps as the hallway splintered and buckled behind me. I could feel the air shifting, the walls groaning like they were alive, trying to close in around me. Just as I reached the lobby, the ground heaved, throwing me forward. I hit the floor hard, my vision swimming. When I looked back, the hallway was gone. In its place was a jagged void, the edges of it still crumbling, and from deep within came the faint sound of something moving. Scraping. Climbing. I scrambled to my feet and backed away, my chest tight with terror. The lodge wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it was breaking apart. Whatever had happened to that girl, whatever I had just seen, it wasn't over. The floor beneath me groaned again, and I knew this place wasn't letting anyone leave. Not without a cost. Part 6. What Lies Below. The gaping hole where the hallway once stood yawned like an open mouth, and from its depths came a sound I couldn't place, wet and guttural, like something dragging itself through mud. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, echoing up from the void. My legs refused to move. My body felt like stone, frozen by whatever was clawing its way toward me. Then I saw it. A hand, if you could call it that, emerged from the darkness, its fingers unnaturally long, tipped with jagged, blackened nails. The skin was sickly pale, mottled with veins that pulsed as though alive. Another hand followed, then a head, featureless save for its cracked surface, like dried clay. It moved with a slow, deliberate malice, pulling itself up onto the crumbling floor. I stumbled back, my feet catching on the uneven carpet. The creature dragged itself fully into the light, its limbs jerking with unnatural precision. Its body was humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted, its torso twisting unnaturally with each movement. And its face, dear God, its face. There was nothing there but smooth skin and a single fissure running vertically, leaking the same black ichor I'd seen before. It paused, its head tilting toward me as though it could see without eyes. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and I realized it was making a sound, not a growl or a roar, but something low and guttural, like words spoken through water. "You don't belong here," it said, the voice vibrating in my skull. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. My hands clawed at the floor, trying to push myself away, but the thing moved faster than I expected. It was on me in an instant, its hands slamming down next to my face. The smell of decay and rust filled my nose as it leaned closer, the crack in its face widening to reveal jagged shards of something inside, teeth, perhaps, or bone. "Remember," it hissed, and suddenly images flooded my mind. I was driving in the rain, headlights cutting through the downpour. A sign loomed ahead. "The Lodge, vacancies." I remembered pulling in, the gravel crunching under my tires. But there was more, something I hadn't recalled before. Someone was with me. A man. His face was blurred in my memory, but I could hear his voice, calm and steady, telling me to turn back. "This place isn't safe." I didn't listen. Why didn't I listen? The memory shattered as the creature's grip tightened on the floor next to me, its crackling voice pulling me back to the present. "You opened the door," it said, each word a dagger in my mind. "You let them in." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The floor beneath us groaned again, the edges of the void widening as more cracks spiderwebbed outward. The creature reared back, its head tilting toward the sound, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't expected, fear. And then the floor gave way completely. I fell, the air rushing past me as the world turned into chaos. My screams were lost in the roar of crumbling wood and stone. The light above me disappeared, replaced by suffocating darkness. For a moment, I thought this was the end. But I landed, hard, on something soft and wet. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, and I lay there gasping, the smell of rot and mildew filling my senses. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by shadows, the faint outlines of shapes, furniture, walls, a staircase, barely visible in the dim light seeping from cracks above. I wasn't dead. But I wasn't alone. All around me, the darkness shifted, shapes emerging from the gloom. They were people, or what used to be people. Their bodies were twisted, broken, their faces contorted in expressions of anguish. They didn't move like the creature above, they shuffled and swayed, their hollow eyes fixed on me. One of them stepped closer, a woman with half her face missing, her voice a rasping whisper. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her words slow and deliberate, filled with a sorrow that chilled me to my core. "Now you're one of us." The others began to echo her, their voices rising in a mournful chorus. "One of us, one of us." And in the distance, from somewhere deeper in the darkness, I heard the creature again, its guttural growl promising that this was far from over. Part 7. The Basement of the Forgotten. I pressed my back against the cold, wet wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The voices were getting closer, the echoes blending into a low, dreadful hum that seeped into my bones. The figures shambled toward me, their hollow eyes glinting faintly in the darkness. "Stay back," I managed to croak, my voice cracking. My throat was dry, and my chest felt tight, as if the air here carried weight. The woman with the half-missing face was closest now, her steps jerking and uneven. She tilted her head, her remaining eye locked on me. "You opened the door," she rasped, her voice grating like broken glass. "You let us in." "I don't understand," I shouted, my voice reverberating off the walls. "What door? What did I do?" She stopped a few feet away, her body swaying slightly, her face unreadable. Around her, the others stood still, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim light. The hum of their voices quieted, replaced by a suffocating silence. "You invited us back," the woman said, her tone softer now, almost pitying. "They only needed one to remember. Just one to open the way." "What are you talking about?" I said, my hands gripping the wall behind me as if I could push through it. "I don't remember anything." She leaned closer, and I could see the raw, glistening flesh where half her face had been. The smell of decay washed over me, making my stomach churn. "You will," she said. "Soon." Suddenly, the room shook, the walls groaning like they were alive. Dust rained down from above, and the figures recoiled, their voices rising in a panicked chorus. The woman stepped back, her hollow eyes darting to the shadows that stretched along the far wall. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. The growl started low, a rumble that seemed to come from the very foundation of the lodge. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding as something massive shifted in the darkness. It wasn't the skeletal creature from before, this was bigger, its shape indistinct but monstrous. The air grew colder, and the figures around me began to scatter, their movements frantic and disjointed. The woman turned back to me, her ruined face twisted with urgency. "You have to go. Now." "How?" I shouted, the rumbling growing louder. "There's no way out." "There's always a way out," she said, her voice rising over the chaos. "But you won't like what you'll find on the other side." The thing in the shadows moved closer, its presence overwhelming. I couldn't see its form, only the void it created, darker than anything I'd ever known. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Move!" the woman screamed, shoving me hard enough to break my paralysis. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over a pile of debris. Ahead of me, a faint light glimmered, an opening, just large enough to crawl through. Behind me, the growl turned into a deafening roar, and the air was filled with the sound of splintering wood and cracking stone. I didn't think. I just ran. The opening was smaller than I'd thought, and I had to drop to my hands and knees to squeeze through. The sharp edges of the jagged floor bit into my palms, but I didn't care. I crawled as fast as I could, the roar behind me growing fainter but never fully disappearing. When I finally emerged on the other side, I collapsed onto cold, damp ground, gasping for air. The faint light came from above, a broken skylight, its glass streaked with grime and rain. I was in another room, this one even more dilapidated than the last. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling. The silence here was absolute, oppressive, but I knew it wouldn't last. Whatever was behind me wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time. In the corner of the room was a door, its surface warped and splintered. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, I could see a faint glow, a sickly yellow light that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go through it, but I had no choice. Staying here wasn't an option. I stepped toward the door, my body trembling with each step. As I reached for the handle, I heard it again, soft, distant whispers, the same ones I'd heard in my room. "It's not an exit. It's a choice." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The glow beyond the door pulsed faintly, like it was alive. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped through. What I saw on the other side made me wish I'd stayed in the dark. Part 8. The Room of Truth. I stepped into the room, and the doors slammed shut behind me with a sound that echoed endlessly. The air here was thicker, heavier, with a faint buzzing hum that pressed against my ears. The yellow glow I'd seen from the outside wasn't coming from a lamp or a window. It emanated from the walls themselves, pulsing faintly like the beat of a heart. The room was larger than it should have been, impossibly vast, its edges fading into shadow. In the center stood a table, rough and splintered, with an object resting on it, a small, cracked mirror. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I didn't want to go near it, but my legs carried me forward, as though something unseen was pulling me closer. The whispers returned, louder this time, their words slithering through my mind like oil. "This is where it begins." I reached the table and stared down at the mirror. Its surface was dark, almost black, and spiderwebbed with fractures that shimmered faintly in the unnatural light. My reflection wasn't there. Instead, the glass seemed to ripple, showing fleeting images, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. But then I saw myself. It wasn't me as I was now. It was a version of me I couldn't remember, younger, with a haunted look in my eyes. In the reflection, I was standing in the same room, my hands pressed flat against the table, staring into the mirror with a look of pure terror. My lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping until they became a cacophony. The images in the mirror shifted, faster now, blurring together until they settled on a single, horrific scene. It was the lobby of the lodge, but not as I'd first seen it. The place was in ruins, its walls charred and crumbling, the furniture broken and scattered. Bodies lay twisted and lifeless on the floor, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and fear. The old woman from the front desk was among them, her milky eyes staring at nothing. And at the center of it all, standing in a pool of blood, was me. My reflection stared back at me, its face smeared with red, its eyes hollow and lifeless. It smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched too wide, and whispered a single word that cut through the chaos in my mind. "Remember." I stumbled back from the table, my chest heaving. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls pulsating more violently now, the yellow light growing harsher. The whispers turned to screams, overlapping cries of anguish and rage that made my head throb. And then the mirror shattered. The explosion of glass sent me reeling, shards raining down around me. When I looked up, the room had changed. The table was gone, replaced by a gaping hole in the floor. From its depths came a blinding light, white and searing, and the sound of a distant roar. I felt myself being pulled toward it, the force of the light tugging at my body like gravity. I clawed at the floor, my fingers scraping against the rough wood, but it was useless. The pull was too strong. As I slid closer to the edge, I saw them, figures rising from the hole, their shapes indistinct and shifting, their faces obscured by shadow. They surrounded me, their presence cold and suffocating, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they were familiar. They were the people I'd seen in the basement, the twisted, broken figures, but they were different now. Whole. Perfect. And their faces were mine. Every one of them was me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The light consumed everything, and as I fell into the void, a single thought echoed in my mind, clear and undeniable. I wasn't a victim. I'd been here before. And I'd brought this place with me. Part 9: The Void. Falling into the light wasn't like falling through air. It was slower, more suffocating, like being dragged into water so thick and cold that it pressed into my chest and stole the breath from my lungs. The light was blinding at first, but then it dulled into something strange, a milky, endless gray, like fog that had swallowed the world whole. When I hit the bottom, I didn't feel pain. Instead, I felt weight. A crushing, inescapable heaviness that pinned me to the ground. The floor wasn't wood or stone or anything I could name. It was warm, pulsing faintly beneath me, as though I were lying on a living thing. I forced myself to sit up, every movement an effort against the oppressive air. The void stretched endlessly around me, but I wasn't alone. The figures were there, circling me like predators, their faces still my own. Each of them stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, their expressions eerily calm. But their eyes, they were empty, black pits that reflected nothing, not even the dim light of the void. And when they spoke, their voices came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping like a distorted echo. "You've come back. I don't know what this is," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. "I don't know what's happening." One of the figures stepped closer, its movements smooth and deliberate. It was identical to me in every way, down to the scar on my right hand, the one I'd gotten when I was 12. It crouched in front of me, tilting its head like it was studying me. "You do," it said, its voice softer but no less chilling. "You've always known." "I don't." "You brought us here," it interrupted, its tone sharpening. "This place, this prison, it doesn't exist without you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I shook my head, scrambling backward. "No. No, that's not true. I didn't." "You opened the door," another figure said, stepping out from the circle. "You remembered, and the door opened." "I don't understand," I shouted. The figures only watched me, their faces unnervingly blank. The weight in the air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The first figure leaned closer, its empty eyes inches from mine. "You will." And then it touched me. Its hand was cold, unnaturally so, and the moment its fingers brushed my skin, the memories came flooding back. Disjointed and fragmented at first, like broken shards of glass cutting into my mind. I was driving. The rain was heavy, the road slick and treacherous. I wasn't alone, someone was with me, sitting in the passenger seat. A man, his face still blurred in my memory. We were arguing, our voices raised over the pounding of the rain. "Turn back," he said, his tone pleading. "We shouldn't be here." "We don't have a choice," I snapped, gripping the wheel tighter. "You don't understand what's at stake. You're playing with things you don't understand," he shouted. "You don't know what will happen if you—" The memory shattered, replaced by another. I was standing in front of the lodge, the rain pouring down around me. The man was gone, and I was holding something in my hands, a key, heavy and warm, etched with strange symbols. The lodge loomed above me, its windows dark and lifeless. But it wasn't abandoned. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I stepped inside. Another fragment. The door. Room 113. The same looping symbol from the key carved into the wood. My hand was on the handle, trembling as I turned it. I knew, even then, that I shouldn't open it. That whatever was on the other side would change everything. But I opened it anyway. The memories stopped as abruptly as they'd started. I was back in the void, the figures still circling me, their faces twisted with faint, cruel smiles. "You let it out," one of them said, its voice dripping with accusation. "You opened the door and let it out." "What did I let out?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, its face splitting into a grotesque grin. "Us." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The light in the void shifted, darkening as the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The figures stepped back, their forms blurring into shadows as a new presence filled the space. Something was coming. Something worse than them. And it was coming for me. Part 10. The Presence. The trembling grew violent, the pulsing ground beneath me lurching like it was alive and writhing in pain. The figures, the other versions of me, faded into the haze, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. But they weren't gone, I could feel them watching, their hollow gazes burrowing into me from the shadows. And then the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with expectation. It pressed against my ears, filled my lungs, and froze my limbs. I could feel it before I saw it, a presence vast and incomprehensible, something that couldn't exist in any rational world. It emerged from the void like a black tide, an immense, undulating mass that seemed to devour the faint light around it. Its surface shimmered with unnatural ripples, shifting and contorting as though it couldn't hold a single shape. I couldn't find its edges. It stretched infinitely in every direction, swallowing everything in its path. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the smell of decay was so overpowering that I gagged. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, a speck in the face of something so immense and ancient that it defied comprehension. It didn't have a face, but it turned toward me, and I felt its gaze, a searing, invasive force that cut through my thoughts and exposed every hidden fear, every regret. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, trembling as its voice rumbled through the void. You remember now. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a vibration that reverberated through every cell in my body. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was inside me, pulling at my memories, dredging up pieces of the truth I had buried. I don't know what you want, I shouted, my voice cracking. I don't understand any of this. You do. The ground beneath me shifted, and I realized with a sinking dread that I was being dragged closer to the presence. My hands clawed at the surface, but there was nothing to hold on to, only the strange, pulsing warmth of the living void. The closer I got, the more the memories returned, sharper now, cutting into my mind like shards of glass. The lodge. The door. Room 113. I wasn't just a guest. I had been here before many times. The first time, I had stumbled into the place by accident, just as I thought I had now. But I had stayed. I had explored. And I had found it. The presence, locked behind that door, waiting for someone foolish enough to release it. I hadn't just opened the door. I had done something worse. I had made a bargain. A desperate, foolish deal to save myself from something I could no longer remember. And the cost of that deal, it was them. The people I'd seen in the basement, the distorted figures that wore my face. They were the price I had paid. Fragments of myself, taken and twisted into something unrecognizable. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The memories slammed into me all at once, and I screamed, clutching my head as the truth sank in. This place, the lodge, the void, it wasn't a prison. It was a cycle, one I had created and couldn't escape. Every time I returned, I brought more of myself, more memories, more pieces for the presence to consume. You used me, I whispered, my voice trembling. You tricked me. The presence rumbled, its surface rippling with what I could only describe as amusement. You came willingly. You always do. I felt the ground shift again, pulling me closer. The void seemed to close in around me, the oppressive darkness pressing against my skin. The presence loomed over me, vast and infinite, and I realized with a sickening clarity what it wanted. It wasn't just a piece of me this time. It wanted everything. I tried to push back, to resist, but my body wouldn't move. The cold seeped into my bones, numbing my limbs, slowing my thoughts. The presence leaned closer, its formless mass enveloping me, and I felt it begin to pull. It was tearing me apart, not physically but mentally, stripping away every thought, every memory, every part of who I was. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The last thing I heard was its voice, calm and final. You belong to me now. And then everything went black. Part 11 fractured. When I woke, the void was gone. I was lying on cold, cracked tile, the air damp and thick with mildew. Above me, a single, flickering bulb swung gently, casting weak light that made the shadows writhe across the walls. I didn't recognize the room. It was small and windowless, the walls streaked with dark stains I didn't want to think about. For a moment I didn't move. My mind felt heavy, sluggish, like pieces of it were missing. The memories of the void and the presence lingered like a fading nightmare, but the details slipped through my fingers every time I tried to grasp them. The only thing I knew for sure was that something had changed. I sat up slowly, my muscles aching as though I'd been through a brutal fight. My clothes were damp and clung to my skin, and when I looked down, I saw smudges of black, like soot or ash, streaked across my hands. My head throbbed as fragmented images flashed before my eyes, the lodge, the mirror, the faces that weren't quite mine. And the presence. I could still feel it, faint and distant, like a shadow pressed against the back of my mind. But it wasn't here. Not fully. I was alone. Or so I thought. The faintest sound reached me then, a low, rasping breath, just beyond the edge of the light. I froze, my pulse quickening. The shadows shifted, and I saw it. A figure, hunched and misshapen, crouched in the far corner of the room. Its body was shrouded in darkness, its face hidden, but its presence was suffocating. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice raw and unfamiliar. The figure didn't move. Its breathing remained slow and deliberate, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. I pushed myself to my feet, leaning against the wall for support, my eyes never leaving the corner. "Do you hear me?" I tried again, louder this time. "Who are you?" The figure twitched, a jerky movement that made my stomach turn. And then it spoke. "You brought it here." The voice was raspy and broken, like it hadn't been used in years. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though the words felt hollow. A part of me did know. A part of me had always known. "You opened it," the figure hissed, its tone rising with anger. "You let it out." I shook my head, backing away. No, that's not. "You did this!" it screamed, lunging forward. The light caught its face, and I recoiled in horror. It wasn't a face at all, just a blank, featureless expanse, smooth and pale, save for a single crack running down the center. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and hitting the wall hard. The figure advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural, its breath rasping louder with each step. I didn't mean to," I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. "I didn't know." "You knew," it said, its voice a guttural growl now. "You always knew." It reached for me, its hand elongated and claw-like, but before it could touch me, the light above us exploded. The room plunged into darkness, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. For a moment there was silence. And then, from somewhere in the blackness, I heard it. The voice. The presence. "You cannot escape." The walls began to tremble, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room. I scrambled to my feet, blind and disoriented, my hands searching for an exit. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though the void was creeping back in. And then I felt it, a door handle, cool and solid beneath my fingers. I didn't think. I turned it and threw the door open, stumbling into whatever lay beyond. I found myself back in the lodge. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, its walls warped and pulsing faintly in the dim light. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling every corner of the space. They overlapped, voices upon voices, but one phrase cut through them all. "It's not over." I started to run. Part 12, the cycle begins again. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and warping with each frantic step I took. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that blurred into a single, resounding chant. "You cannot leave! You cannot leave!" I didn't know where I was going. There was no end in sight, no door, no escape. The walls began to shift, closing in, their surfaces rippling like water. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Something behind me was following, its presence cold and vast, pressing against my back like a storm about to break. Then I saw it. Ahead, a door materialized, the only solid thing in the endless distortion of the hallway. Its surface was smooth and dark, and etched into the wood was the looping symbol that haunted my memories. It was the same door I had opened before, the one I had sworn never to touch again. Room 113. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through my body. Behind me, the whispers fell silent. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation. I had no choice. I turned the handle. The door swung open, revealing a room that was not a room but something vast and infinite. The void stretched out before me, the pulsing light from its depths illuminating shapes, figures, that swayed and writhed in the shadows. They were waiting for me. "You always come back," said a voice, low and terrible. The presence emerged from the void, its formless mass shifting and undulating as it filled the space. The weight of it crushed the air from my lungs, and I fell to my knees. "Why?" I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "Why me?" "You chose this," the voice said, calm and final. "You opened the door. You let me in." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I didn't know. I didn't." "You knew," it interrupted, its tone colder now. You always knew. The floor beneath me began to shift, the warmth of the void seeping through my skin, pulling me down. I clawed at the surface, but there was nothing to hold on to. The faces of the figures in the void came into focus, and I saw myself reflected in every one of them. They weren't just me, they were all of me. Every version, every choice, every fragment that had been stolen. You belong to me, the presence said, and I felt it reach into my mind, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. The memories I had fought so hard to reclaim began to slip away again, torn from me like shreds of paper in the wind. No! I screamed, struggling against the pull. But it was too late. The void was consuming me, piece by piece, erasing everything I was, everything I had been. And then, in the final moments before the darkness claimed me, I understood. This was the price. The cycle was the cost of my bargain, an endless loop where I would return again and again, never remembering, always repeating the same mistakes. And every time, the presence would take more of me, until there was nothing left. As the last fragments of my mind dissolved into the void, a single thought remained, faint and fleeting. This time, maybe I won't forget. When I woke, the lodge was quiet. I was standing in the lobby, my hands clutching a heavy brass key. Room 113. The desk was empty, but the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I didn't remember how I had gotten there, or why my chest felt so tight, but something about the place was familiar. A whisper brushed against my thoughts, faint but insistent. Welcome back. And before I could stop myself, I walked toward the door.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.